Picture this: January 7th, 1943. An 86-year-old man dies alone in a New York hotel room. The FBI immediately seizes all his papers. 5 months later, the United States Supreme Court makes a shocking announcement. Guglielmo Marconi, the man the entire world had celebrated as the inventor of radio for 4 decades, did not actually invent the radio. The patents belonged to the dead man all along. His name was Nikola Tesla. And he never knew he was vindicated. But here's the really crazy part. The Supreme Court didn't rule in Tesla's favor out of some sudden passion for historical accuracy. They did it to avoid paying $800 million, which would be about $12 billion today. The United States government had used radio technology extensively during World War II, and the Marconi company wanted its royalties. So the government's solution was simple. Declare that Marconi never invented it in the first place. This is the story of how a wealthy Italian aristocrat built a global media empire on stolen technology, how the true inventors died in poverty and obscurity, and how corporate greed and government corruption conspired to rewrite one of the most important chapters in technological history. It's about 3 brilliant inventors, billions of dollars, mysterious deaths, and a legal battle that lasted longer than most marriages. And if you're thinking this sounds like some wild conspiracy theory, well, it's all documented in Supreme Court records, patent filings, and corporate documents that took decades to surface. The real conspiracy was keeping the truth buried for so long. The era of electrical warfare. Before we dive into who actually invented what, you need to understand what the world was like in the 1880s and 90s. This was the second industrial revolution, and it was absolutely brutal. Think of it as a startup race, except instead of building apps, these guys were building technologies that could electrocute you, burn down your factory, or make you rich beyond imagination. The electric power industry was exploding. Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse were literally at war over whether homes should use direct current or alternating current. People were getting electrocuted during public demonstrations. Edison even electrocuted an elephant to try to prove AC power was dangerous. It was that kind of era. Telegraph networks had already connected the world, but they required physical wires everywhere. Imagine having Wi-Fi but needing to run a copper cable to every single device. That's what the telegraph was like. And those wires, they could be cut, they could be tapped, they were vulnerable. Every navy in the world was desperate for a way to communicate with ships at sea without using visual signals or, I kid you not, carrier pigeons. The patent system had become completely weaponized. Corporations were filing patents on everything, then using armies of lawyers to crush competitors. Thomas Edison had what he called an invention factory, where he employed dozens of engineers, and he filed patents on everything they created, whether he personally invented it or not. Patent trolling was already a thing, just with better mustaches. And the money? Absolutely insane. We're talking about fortunes that would make modern tech billionaires jealous. A single revolutionary patent could be worth what selling Instagram to Facebook would be worth today. J.P. Morgan, the banker who basically owned half of America, was throwing money at any technology that looked promising. But he was also perfectly willing to destroy inventors who threatened his existing investments. International tensions were building toward what would become World War I. The British Empire controlled most of the world's telegraph cables, and they did not want anyone breaking their communications monopoly. Germany was building up its military and needed secure communications. Russia was modernizing. Italy, where our story begins, was desperate for technological prestige to compete with the great powers. Into this cutthroat environment came 3 men who would each claim to have invented wireless communication. One was a Serbian genius who could visualize entire electrical systems in his head. One was a humble Russian physicist working in near poverty. And one was a wealthy Italian aristocrat with excellent social connections and absolutely no qualms about taking credit for other people's work. If you're into stories about the geniuses and frauds who built the modern world, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments if you'd heard the real story about radio before today, because I'm betting most people still believe the official version. The boy who didn't invent anything. Let's start with Guglielmo Marconi, because his story is the easiest to understand. He was born on April 25th, 1874, in Bologna, Italy. And here's the first thing you need to know about Marconi. He was rich. Not just comfortable, rich, rich. His father Giuseppe was a wealthy Italian landowner, but more importantly, his mother Annie was an heiress to the Jameson whiskey fortune. Yes, that Jameson, the Irish whiskey family. Marconi grew up in a world of private tutors, country estates, and social connections with the British aristocracy through his mother's side. He never got a formal engineering degree. He never attended university. He just had money, time, and access to the scientific journals where real inventors were publishing their discoveries. As a young man in his early 20s, Marconi became fascinated with the idea of wireless telegraphy. Several physicists had already demonstrated that electromagnetic waves could travel through space without wires. Heinrich Hertz had proven their existence in 1888. Oliver Lodge had demonstrated wireless transmission in 1894. And here's the key detail. All of these discoveries were being published in scientific journals that Marconi read obsessively. In 1895, when Marconi was just 21 years old, he set up a laboratory in his family's attic. And according to the story he would tell for the rest of his life, he suddenly figured out how to transmit signals wirelessly over long distances. A miraculous breakthrough by a brilliant young mind, right? Except here's what actually happened. Marconi read about the experiments that other scientists had already conducted, built equipment based on their published designs, and then his wealthy mother funded a massive public relations campaign to promote him as the inventor. They used her social connections in Britain to get access to the British Post Office, which was desperate for a wireless system to maintain their communications empire. Think about it this way. Imagine if some rich kid today read about how artificial intelligence works in research papers, hired some engineers to build him an AI system using existing techniques, and then claimed he invented artificial intelligence. That's basically what Marconi did, except in the 1890s, it was much easier to get away with. But here's what nobody knew at the time. Two other men had already demonstrated wireless transmission before Marconi ever sent his first signal. And their stories are a lot more interesting. The priest's son who actually did it first. Alexander Stepanovich Popov was born on March 16, 1859, in a tiny mining village in the Ural Mountains of Russia. His father was an Orthodox priest, and the family had basically no money. But Popov was brilliant. He studied mathematics and physics at St. Petersburg University, and by the 1890s, he was working as an instructor at a naval school. Popov was obsessed with the same problem everyone else was working on. How do you communicate with ships at sea? Russia had a massive coastline and a growing navy, but once ships sailed out of sight, they were completely isolated. No way to warn them about storms, no way to coordinate attacks, nothing. Here's where the timeline gets really important. On May 7, 1895, Alexander Popov gave a public demonstration of wireless transmission at the Russian Physical and Chemical Society in St. Petersburg. This was a formal scientific presentation with dozens of witnesses. He transmitted a signal across a large room and received it on a device he had built. This was a full year before Marconi claimed to have successfully transmitted a wireless signal. Popov's equipment was brilliant. He used a coherer, which was a glass tube filled with metal filings that would conduct electricity when radio waves hit it, attached to a device that would automatically tap the tube to reset it after each signal. This automatic resetting was his innovation, and it made continuous reception possible. He also added a better antenna design that improved reception range. But here's the problem. Popov was working in Russia. The Russian government immediately classified his work as a military secret because they saw the obvious naval applications. Popov couldn't get international patents because the Tsar's bureaucracy wouldn't let him. And he couldn't publish his designs in Western scientific journals because everything was locked down by military secrecy. Meanwhile, Marconi was in Britain, backed by his mother's whiskey money and her connections to the British establishment. He filed patents, he got newspaper coverage, he gave demonstrations to admirals and politicians. He had something Popov didn't have: a marketing budget and social access. Popov continued working on wireless technology for the Russian Navy. He improved his designs, extended transmission ranges, and actually deployed working wireless systems on Russian warships. But outside Russia, nobody knew about him. Western scientists had no idea a Russian physicist had beaten everyone to the punch. On January 13, 1906, Alexander Popov died suddenly of a stroke. He was only 46 years old. The timing was convenient, wasn't it? Just as international patent disputes over wireless technology were heating up, one of the potential claimants conveniently died. But I'm sure it was just a coincidence. After Popov's death, the Soviet government would eventually try to reclaim his priority in inventing radio. But by then, Marconi's version of history was already established in the West. The Cold War made anything the Soviets said automatically suspect. And besides, Marconi had lawyers and corporate power that dead Russian scientists couldn't compete with. But even Popov wasn't the first inventor to demonstrate wireless transmission. There was someone even earlier, someone whose story is even more remarkable. The man who saw the future. Nikola Tesla was born on July 10, 1856, in Smiljan, in what was then the Austrian Empire and is now Croatia. His father was a Serbian Orthodox priest, and his mother, despite having no formal education, was constantly inventing small mechanical devices and tools to make household work easier. Tesla would later say he inherited his inventive genius from her. Tesla's brain worked differently than other people's. He had this ability to visualize complete machines in his head, down to every dimension and specification, and then build them without having to make a single prototype or adjustment. He could literally run simulations in his imagination. Today we might say he had some form of synesthesia or enhanced visual spatial processing. Back then, people just thought he was either a genius or crazy, often both. He studied electrical engineering at the Austrian Polytechnic, but he never graduated. The professors thought his ideas about alternating current motors were impossible. Tesla left school and eventually ended up working for Thomas Edison in New York in the 1880s. That relationship famously ended badly. Edison promised Tesla $50,000, which would be over $1 million today. If Tesla could improve Edison's direct current systems, Tesla did it. Edison refused to pay, claiming it was just a joke. Tesla quit and spent the next year digging ditches for $2 a day to survive. From electrical genius to manual laborer in a few months. That's the kind of era this was. But Tesla eventually got funding from investors and set up his own laboratory. And in 1893, 2 years before Popov's public demonstration and 3 years before Marconi's claims, Tesla demonstrated wireless transmission at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia and at the National Electric Light Association in St. Louis. These weren't secret demonstrations. These were public events. Tesla showed how he could transmit electrical power without wires. He lit up phosphorescent bulbs at a distance using electromagnetic waves. He explained the principles of resonant circuits, tuning, and how different frequencies could carry different signals without interfering with each other. Basically, he explained how radio would work. The demonstrations were written up in scientific journals and newspapers. Anyone could have read about them. And you know who definitely did read about them? Guglielmo Marconi. We know this because Marconi's own notebooks reference scientific papers that describe Tesla's work. In 1900, Tesla filed U.S. patent number 6455576 for a system of transmission of electrical energy. This patent described a complete wireless transmission system including transmitters, receivers, and the principle of tuning to specific frequencies. It was granted in 1900, which becomes important later. But Tesla's vision went way beyond just sending telegraph signals. He wanted to transmit electrical power wirelessly. He wanted to provide free electricity to the entire world. He imagined a global communication system where anyone could send messages anywhere instantly. He was basically describing the internet, cellular networks, and wireless power transmission, all at the turn of the 20th century. His most ambitious project was Wardenclyffe Tower, a massive wireless transmission facility he began building on Long Island in 1901. The tower was going to be 187 feet tall, and Tesla claimed it could transmit both communication signals and electrical power anywhere in the world. The financier J.P. Morgan had initially backed the project, investing $150,000, which would be about $4.5 million today. But when Morgan realized that Tesla's system would provide free, wireless electricity that couldn't be metered or controlled, he immediately cut off funding. Why would Morgan support a technology that would make his investments in copper wire, power plants, and electrical infrastructure worthless? Other investors followed Morgan's lead. Wall Street blackballed Tesla. The Wardenclyffe project collapsed. The tower was eventually torn down for scrap during World War I, and Tesla, the man who had invented AC motors, radio, remote control, and numerous other technologies, was left broke. But what nobody knew was that his vindication was coming. It would just take 4 more decades, and he'd be dead by the time it happened. The aristocrat's master plan. So while Tesla was running out of money and Popov was locked behind Russian military secrecy, what was Marconi doing? Building an empire. In 1896, Marconi traveled to Britain with his mother. Remember, she was Irish aristocracy with connections throughout the British establishment. They went straight to William Preece, the chief electrical engineer of the British Post Office. Preece saw immediately that wireless technology could help Britain maintain its communications monopoly over its global empire. Preece arranged public demonstrations for Marconi. He introduced him to military officials and politicians. He gave Marconi access to facilities and equipment. And critically, he endorsed Marconi as the inventor of wireless telegraphy, even though Preece must have known about the prior work by Lodge, Tesla, and others. Marconi filed British patent number 12039 in June of 1896. The patent application was essentially a description of equipment that other inventors had already built, with minor modifications. But it was granted, and that patent became the foundation of Marconi's legal claims. In 1897, Marconi founded the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company, which was later renamed Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company. He raised money from investors who were dazzled by the demonstrations and the backing of the British establishment. The company began installing wireless equipment on ships and coastal stations. Here's where Marconi showed his real genius, which wasn't in invention but in business and public relations. He created a monopoly system where ships could only use Marconi equipment and could only communicate with Marconi coastal stations. If you wanted to send a wireless message, you paid Marconi's rates, and his wireless operators were instructed to ignore messages from non-Marconi stations. It was a closed ecosystem, kind of like Apple's walled garden today, except way more aggressive. In 1901, Marconi claimed to have successfully transmitted a wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean, from Cornwall, England, to Newfoundland, Canada. 3 dots in Morse code, supposedly representing the letter S. This made him internationally famous. He was hailed as a genius. The stock price of his company soared. But here's the thing. That transatlantic transmission was disputed even at the time. The signal was weak and could have been atmospheric noise. There were no independent witnesses on the receiving end, and the technical details Marconi provided didn't quite add up for a lot of engineers. But by then, Marconi had created such a powerful publicity machine that questioning him seemed like questioning progress itself. The Marconi Company became enormously valuable. In 1901, he founded American Marconi in the United States. He signed contracts with the British Navy, the Italian Navy, commercial shipping lines, and governments around the world. He was getting rich, really rich, while Tesla was being evicted from hotels and Popov was teaching in Russia. But Marconi had a problem looming on the horizon. His patents were built on shaky ground. Other inventors had filed patents covering the same basic technology. Tesla's patents, in particular, predated Marconi's by several years. And as the wireless industry grew, the patent disputes started piling up. Which brings us to what happened during the patent wars, when patents become weapons. By the early 1900s, the wireless industry was exploding. Every navy wanted wireless for their ships. Shipping companies needed it for safety and logistics. The Titanic disaster in 1912 made wireless communication seem essential after the ship's wireless operator sent distress signals that saved hundreds of lives. Radio was clearly the future, and that meant the patent battles became vicious. Here's what most people don't understand about patents. They're not really about rewarding inventors. They're about creating legal weapons that companies can use to destroy competition. A patent gives you the right to stop other people from using an invention, which means you can shut down competitors, demand massive royalty payments, or force companies to buy you out at inflated prices. Marconi's company was aggressive about enforcing its patents. They sued anyone who tried to build wireless equipment. They demanded royalty payments from navies and shipping companies. They were making money hand over fist from licensing fees. But they had a problem. Their patents were being challenged. Oliver Lodge, the British physicist who had demonstrated wireless transmission in 1894, had filed patents that predated some of Marconi's key claims. Tesla's patents from 1900 clearly described fundamental radio technologies before Marconi's patents. And there were other inventors who had filed patents around the same time. In 1904, the U.S. Patent Office issued Marconi U.S. Patent Number 763772 for wireless telegraphy. But that same year, they also upheld some of Tesla's earlier patents. The situation was getting legally messy. During World War I, things got even more complicated. The U.S. government wanted to use wireless technology extensively for military communications, but they didn't want to pay the Marconi Company's high royalty rates. So they did something interesting. They invoked wartime emergency powers and seized control of all radio patents. They basically told everyone they were creating a patent pool where all the wireless technology would be shared for the war effort. After the war, in 1919, the U.S. government helped create the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, specifically to prevent foreign control of radio technology in America. American Marconi was forced to sell its assets to RCA. The government was getting very interested in controlling who owned what in the wireless industry. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, radio became huge. Commercial broadcasting started. RCA became one of the most powerful corporations in America. Marconi remained wealthy and famous in Europe. He even won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909, sharing it with another radio pioneer, but not Tesla or Popov. Tesla, meanwhile, was living in increasingly cheap hotels in New York, feeding pigeons in the park, and trying to interest companies in his other inventions. Most people had forgotten he had anything to do with radio. The history book said Marconi invented it. That was that. Then World War II started. The $800 million problem. When World War II erupted in 1939, radio technology was absolutely critical. Military communications, aircraft navigation, radar, naval operations. Everything depended on wireless technology. The United States military was using radio extensively in every theater of the war, and the Marconi Company wanted their royalties. The Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America filed suit claiming the U.S. government owed them massive royalty payments for the use of radio technology during the war. The amount they claimed? $800 million. In 1940s, money. That would be approximately $12 billion in today's money. This was an amount that would have bankrupted the war effort. The government absolutely did not want to pay it. So the U.S. Department of Justice started looking very carefully at the Marconi patents. And they discovered something interesting. Maybe Marconi hadn't actually invented radio after all. Maybe there were prior inventors whose patents predated Marconi's claims. Maybe, just maybe, the Marconi company had no right to collect royalties because their patents were invalid. The government's lawyers started gathering evidence. They pulled Tesla's old patents from 1900. They found Oliver Lodge's patents from the 1890s. They even found patents from other inventors like Father Giuseppe Murgas, a Slovak priest who had demonstrated wireless systems in 1904. The evidence was overwhelming that Marconi's patents were based on technologies that others had invented first. On January 7, 1943, Nikola Tesla died in his room at the New Yorker Hotel. He was 86 years old and completely broke. He died alone. Within hours, FBI agents showed up at the hotel and seized all his papers, which contained decades of research notes, invention ideas, and correspondence. Officially, they said it was to prevent enemy agents from obtaining sensitive technology. But the timing was interesting. 5 months later, on June 21, 1943, the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America versus United States. The court ruled that Marconi's key patents were invalid. They specifically cited Tesla's patents from 1900 as having priority. The court acknowledged that other inventors, including Oliver Lodge and John Stone, had also done prior work. The decision essentially said that radio was not invented by any one person, but was the result of accumulated work by multiple inventors, with Tesla's contributions being particularly fundamental. The Marconi company lost its case. The U.S. government owed them nothing. $800 million went away just like that. And Nikola Tesla, the man who had been vindicated by the highest court in the land, had been dead for 5 months. He never knew. Some people think that's just an unfortunate coincidence. Other people notice that it's remarkably convenient that Tesla died right before the Supreme Court case concluded. Tesla's papers were seized. His research disappeared into government vaults. And the case was settled without the possibility of Tesla testifying or making claims for his own compensation. But I'm sure it was all just a coincidence. The colonial inventor nobody remembers. There's another inventor whose story reveals just how biased the patent system was. Jagadish Chandra Bose. Bose was born in 1858 in Bengal, India, when India was under British colonial rule. He studied natural sciences at Cambridge University, and by the 1890s, he was a professor of physics in Calcutta. He was brilliant, doing groundbreaking work on electromagnetic waves and their properties. In November of 1895, just months after Popov's demonstration in Russia, Bose gave a public demonstration of wireless transmission in Calcutta. He transmitted signals across a hall, rang a bell remotely, and even demonstrated that electromagnetic waves could pass through walls and multiple rooms. His demonstrations were written up in scientific journals. British scientists who attended were impressed. But Bose made a critical mistake. He didn't immediately file for patents. He believed scientific knowledge should be freely shared for the benefit of humanity. He published his findings in academic journals, explaining his technology in detail. Marconi read those journals. In fact, we know that Marconi was reading British scientific publications where Bose's work was described. And Marconi's early equipment used designs that were remarkably similar to what Bose had demonstrated. When Bose finally did try to file patents years later, after realizing that corporate interests were profiting from his work, he faced discrimination in the British patent system. He was a colonial subject. His patents were challenged and delayed. Meanwhile, Marconi's company was filing patents on similar technologies and getting them approved quickly because Marconi had connections in London. Bose eventually received some recognition in his lifetime. He founded the Bose Institute in Calcutta, which is still operating today. But his role in the invention of radio was essentially erased from Western history. If you asked 100 people who invented radio, maybe 1 or 2 would even know Bose's name. This wasn't just about one inventor. The patent system in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was fundamentally biased toward wealthy white Europeans and Americans. Colonial subjects, immigrants, and anyone without social connections had a much harder time getting patents recognized and enforced. Tesla faced some of this bias too, as an immigrant from the Austrian Empire. But at least he was white and eventually became a U.S. citizen. Bose, being Indian, faced even worse prejudice. And Popov, being Russian, was dismissed by Western interests. The story of radio isn't just about technological innovation. It's about how power, money, and social connections determine who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. The real-world consequences. So Marconi built a global empire on stolen technology, became wealthy and famous, and won a Nobel Prize. Tesla died broke and alone, vindicated only after his death. Popov died young and was forgotten in the West. Bose was sidelined by colonial bias, and the Supreme Court conveniently ruled against the Marconi Company only after the main alternative claimant was dead. But what does this actually mean? Why does it matter who really invented radio? First, there's the money. The Marconi Company made billions of dollars in modern terms from licensing fees, equipment sales, and stock value. That wealth came from patents that were based on other people's inventions. Tesla died in poverty while the Marconi family lived in luxury. The patent system failed at its stated purpose of rewarding inventors. Second, there's the impact on technological development. J.P. Morgan cut funding to Tesla's wireless power project because it would have threatened his investments in wired electrical systems. Think about that. We might have had wireless power transmission over a century ago, but it was suppressed because it would have made existing infrastructure investments worthless. How much faster would technology have advanced if inventors' visions had been funded instead of suppressed? Third, there's the historical lesson about how narratives get established. For decades, everyone believed Marconi invented radio because that's what the newspapers said, what the history books said, what the Nobel Prize Committee said. It took a Supreme Court case in the middle of World War II to officially change the story. And even then, most people still believe the old version. This is how history gets written by the winners. Fourth, there's the racial and national bias in the system. Bose's contributions were minimized because he was a colonial subject. Popov's work was ignored because he was Russian. The patent system and the history books favored wealthy Europeans with good connections. This wasn't just about radio. It was about a global system that privileged certain people and nations over others. And fifth, there's the government-corporate collusion. The U.S. government helped create RCA specifically to maintain American control of radio technology. They seized patents during wartime. They helped engineer the Supreme Court case to avoid paying royalties. The partnership between government power and corporate interests shaped not just who got credit for inventing radio, but who controlled the entire communications infrastructure of the 20th century. Radio became the foundation for everything that came after. Television, radar, satellite communications, cell phones, Wi-Fi, all of modern wireless technology traces back to those early experiments. The people who controlled radio patents in the early 20th century controlled the foundation of the modern world. And most of them weren't the actual inventors. The pattern of convenient deaths. Here's something that should make you uncomfortable. A lot of the key figures in the radio invention story died at very convenient times for the Marconi Company and their corporate allies. Alexander Popov died of a stroke at age 46 in 1906, just as patent disputes were heating up. Oliver Lodge, the British physicist whose patents were cited in the Supreme Court case, died in 1940, just before the major legal battles. Father Giuseppe Murgas, the Slovak inventor whose patents also challenged Marconi's claims, died in 1929 under circumstances that his family found suspicious. And then there's Tesla's death in January of 1943, 5 months before the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. The FBI immediately seized all his papers. The official cause of death was heart failure, but some witnesses reported seeing government agents at his hotel in the days before he died. Now, I'm not saying there was a massive conspiracy to murder everyone who challenged Marconi's patents. These men were all getting older. Some of them had health problems. People do die of natural causes, but the pattern is striking. Every major alternative claimant to the invention of radio was dead by the time the Supreme Court case concluded. None of them were alive to testify, to make claims for compensation, or to publicly challenge the historical record. Very convenient. Corporate espionage and corporate violence were not unusual in the era of Industrial Revolution. Companies hired private detective agencies like Pinkerton to spy on competitors and intimidate workers. Industrial accidents were common. The line between legitimate business competition and organized crime was blurry. We know that the Marconi company aggressively defended its patents. We know they had connections to governments and intelligence agencies. We know that millions and eventually billions of dollars were at stake. Would they have gone so far as to eliminate inventors who threatened their monopoly? There's no smoking gun evidence. But there's a pattern that's hard to ignore. And when you consider how much money was involved, how corrupt the patent system was, and how little value was placed on human life in that era, it doesn't seem that far-fetched. The FBI files on Tesla that were declassified in the 1980s reveal that the government was watching him closely in his final years, worried about what technologies he might have developed that could be used by enemy nations. The papers they seized after his death have never been fully released. Some researchers believe Tesla had developed advanced wireless technologies and even weaponry that the government wanted to keep secret. Was Tesla's death hastened by government agents who wanted his research but didn't want him alive to make claims on it? Was the timing of the Supreme Court case deliberately arranged to avoid giving Tesla credit while he could still benefit from it? We probably won't ever know for sure. But it's remarkable how well everything worked out for the government and the major corporations, and how badly it worked out for the actual inventors. What this means for today. So why am I telling you all this? What's the point of digging up a century-old patent dispute? Because the same patterns are happening right now. Think about the modern tech industry. How many times have you seen a small startup develop innovative technology only to have it acquired by a big company, with the original inventors pushed out and forgotten? How often do you hear about patent trolls demanding massive settlements from companies that had the independently developed similar technologies? How much corporate espionage goes on in Silicon Valley that we never hear about? The smartphone patent wars between Apple and Samsung involved billions of dollars and looked remarkably like the wireless wars of the early 1900s. Companies suing each other over rounded corners and swipe gestures, trying to establish monopolies over basic technologies. Facebook famously copied features from Snapchat after trying and failing to buy the company. Google's Android was accused of stealing from Apple's iOS. Every major tech company has been accused of stealing ideas from smaller competitors or independent developers. The story never changes, just the technology. Government-corporate collusion is arguably worse now than it was in Tesla's time. Edward Snowden revealed how the NSA was working directly with tech companies to surveil everyone's communications. When the US government wanted to ban TikTok, it wasn't because of valid security concerns. It was to protect American social media companies from competition. The revolving door between government regulators and the industries they regulate means the system is designed to benefit powerful interests, not inventors or the public. The patent system remains as broken as ever. Patent trolls, companies that exist only to buy up patents and sue people, extract billions from actual innovative companies. The Patent Office grants absurdly broad patents on obvious ideas. It takes years and millions of dollars to challenge a bad patent. Independent inventors have almost no chance against corporate legal teams. And the bias continues. How many inventors from developing countries have created amazing technologies that get stolen by companies in wealthy nations? How many women and minority inventors have their contributions minimized or erased? The systemic problems that allowed Marconi to steal credit for radio are still operating today. The lesson of the radio invention story isn't just historical trivia. It's a warning about how our current system works. The people who actually invent things often die poor and forgotten. The people who are good at business, marketing, and legal maneuvering become rich and famous. And the historical record gets written by whoever has the most money and power. Tesla saw the future. He imagined wireless power transmission, global communication systems, remote-controlled devices. All kinds of technologies we're still developing today. But his vision was suppressed because it threatened existing power structures. How many other revolutionary technologies have been suppressed or delayed because they would disrupt profitable industries? We'll never know because the inventors either give up, get bought out, or die before their ideas can spread. The Supreme Court conspiracy. Let's talk about that Supreme Court decision in more detail because it's one of the most suspicious legal rulings in American history. The case was Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America versus United States. The Marconi Company was claiming $800 million in royalties for the government's use of radio technology during World War II. This was a massive amount of money, enough to significantly impact the war effort and the national budget. The government's defense was that Marconi's patents were invalid because prior inventors, particularly Tesla, had already invented the key technologies. They presented Tesla's patents from 1900, which clearly described wireless transmission systems. They also cited patents from Oliver Lodge, John Stone, and others. The Marconi Company's lawyers argued that while these inventors had done preliminary work, Marconi had been the first to develop a practical, commercial, wireless system. They pointed to his transatlantic transmission, his extensive patent portfolio, and his decades of operating wireless stations around the world. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of the government. They found that Marconi's fundamental patents were invalid because the technologies described in them had been previously invented by Tesla and others. Therefore, the government owed nothing. But here's what's suspicious: the timing and the implications. Tesla died on January 7th, 1943. The Supreme Court ruling was issued on June 21st, 1943. That's 5.5 months. The FBI seized Tesla's papers immediately after his death, supposedly to prevent them from falling into enemy hands during wartime. If the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of Tesla's patents while he was still alive, Tesla or his estate could have claimed massive royalties, not just from the government, but from every company that had been using radio technology for decades. We're talking about amounts that would dwarf the $800 million the Marconi Company was claiming. Tesla's patents covered more fundamental technologies than Marconi's did. But with Tesla dead and his papers seized, there was no one to make those claims. The government could invalidate the Marconi patents, avoid paying $800 million, and not worry about anyone else coming forward with superior patent claims. Some historians have argued that the Supreme Court case had been intentionally delayed until after Tesla's death. The case had been filed years earlier, but it moved through the courts slowly. Was this normal legal process, or was it deliberately stalled until the problematic patent holder was safely dead? The 3 dissenting justices wrote that the majority opinion was twisting patent law to serve the government's financial interests. They argued that regardless of prior patents, Marconi had developed and commercialized radio technology and deserved compensation. But they were outvoted. After the ruling, the government and major corporations had free access to all radio technologies without paying significant royalties to anyone. RCA, which had close ties to the government, became the dominant force in radio and television. The patents that had been fought over for decades became essentially public domain, but only after the original inventors were dead. or had lost control of them. It was a perfect outcome for government and corporate interests, and a disaster for the inventors and their estates. The modern myth. Despite the Supreme Court ruling, most people still believe Marconi invented radio. Why? Because the story had already been established for 40 years before the Supreme Court ruled. History textbooks had been written, museums had been established, the Nobel Prize had been awarded. Changing the story would have required a massive re-education effort that nobody wanted to undertake. Also, the Marconi Company and its successor organizations had a strong interest in maintaining the myth. Even though their patents had been invalidated, the brand value of Marconi the inventor was worth protecting. Companies continued to use the Marconi name and reputation to sell communications equipment and services. National pride played a role too. Italy celebrated Marconi as a national hero, a symbol of Italian genius and innovation. The Italian government wasn't about to start teaching schoolchildren that their hero was actually a fraud who stole other people's inventions. Britain also had a stake in the Marconi myth because British institutions and companies had backed him. The myth persisted because powerful interests wanted it to persist. Telling the truth would have raised uncomfortable questions about corporate power, patent law, and how history gets written. Much easier to just keep telling the simple story. Marconi invented radio. He was a genius. The end. Even today, if you ask most people who invented radio, they'll say Marconi. He's the name everyone knows. Tesla is becoming more famous now thanks to the electric car company named after him and various books and documentaries, but he's still primarily known for AC current, not radio. And Popov? Bose? Almost nobody outside of engineering history circles has heard of them. This is how historical narratives work. The first story that gets established is incredibly hard to dislodge, even when evidence proves it wrong. People don't want to admit they were taught incorrectly. Institutions don't want to rewrite all their materials. National pride resists correction. The truth about who invented radio is buried in Supreme Court documents, academic papers, and specialized history books that most people will never read. The lie continues to circulate in popular culture, simple and convenient and wrong. What could have been? Let's imagine an alternate history where things went differently. Imagine if Tesla had gotten proper funding for Wardenclyffe Tower. His wireless power transmission system could have provided electricity without power lines to remote areas around the world. No need for massive electrical grids, no dependence on centralized power generation. Communities could have been electrified decades earlier than they actually were. Imagine if the patent system had actually rewarded the inventors. Tesla, Popov, Bose, and others could have received royalties that funded their continued research. They could have hired teams, built laboratories, pushed the boundaries of physics and engineering even further. What other inventions might have emerged? Imagine if Popov's work hadn't been classified as a military secret by the Russian government. If his designs had been freely shared with the international scientific community, wireless technology might have advanced faster, saving lives at sea and enabling better communications. Imagine if Bose hadn't faced colonial discrimination in the patent system. Indian scientists might have received more recognition and funding, accelerating scientific development in the colony, and potentially changing the dynamics of colonialism itself. Imagine if corporate and government interests hadn't manipulated the legal system to avoid paying inventors. The message it would have sent: innovation is rewarded, inventors are valued, the system works. Instead, the message was, if you invent something valuable, powerful interests will steal it, and you'll die poor. The opportunity cost of how things actually happened is incalculable. How many potential inventors looked at what happened to Tesla and decided not to pursue their ideas? How many revolutionary technologies were suppressed because they threatened existing industries? How much human potential was wasted? We'll never know what could have been. We only know what actually happened. The wrong people got rich, the right people died poor, and the world moved forward with a foundation built on theft, and lies. But hey, at least we got radio out of it. The documents don't lie. Everything I've told you is documented. This isn't conspiracy theory or speculation. These are facts you can verify yourself. The Supreme Court case Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America vs. United States is public record. You can read the full decision online. The court explicitly ruled that Marconi's patents were invalid and that Tesla and others were the prior inventors. Tesla's patents are in the U.S. Patent Office archives. Patent number 645576 from 1900 describes a complete wireless transmission system, years before Marconi's key patents. Popov's demonstration on May 7, 1895 was documented by the Russian Physical and Chemical Society. Scientific papers were published. The date is not disputed. Bose's demonstrations in 1895 were written up in British scientific journals. British scientists who attended testified to what they saw. His priority is established. The FBI seizure of Tesla's papers after his death is acknowledged in declassified documents. The FBI admits they took his research, though they claim it was for national security reasons. The financial records of the Marconi Company, RCA, and other corporations show billions of dollars in revenue from radio technology. The wealth created by these patents is not theoretical. It's right there in the accounting books. This isn't a case where we have to speculate about what might have happened. The documentary evidence is overwhelming. The only question is why this information isn't more widely known. The answer, of course, is that powerful interests don't want it to be widely known. It's embarrassing to governments, corporations, and institutions. It reveals how corrupt the system was and still is. It challenges comfortable national myths. It makes heroes into villains and villains into heroes. But the truth is sitting there in archives and court records, waiting for anyone curious enough to look. Why this story matters. I know this is a long story about something that happened 100 years ago. Patent disputes and long-dead inventors might not seem relevant to your life today, but here's why it matters. First, because the truth matters. History shapes how we understand the present. If we believe the myth that genius inventors get rewarded and the best technology wins, we won't see the problems in our current system. But if we understand that Tesla died poor while Marconi got rich, we can see that the system has never worked the way we're told it works. Second, because the same patterns are repeating. Every generation has inventors who get screwed by the system, and every generation has wealthy people who take credit for other people's work. If we understand how it happened with radio, we can maybe prevent it from happening as much in the future. Third, because this story shows how power really works. It's not about being the smartest or the most innovative. It's about having money, connections, and the ability to manipulate legal and political systems. That's an uncomfortable truth, but it's one we need to face. Fourth, because it's a reminder to question what we think we know. How many other historical facts are actually myths created by powerful interests? How much of what you learned in school was propaganda or simplified stories that served someone's agenda? And fifth, because maybe, just maybe, learning about inventors like Tesla, Popov, and Bose, who were screwed by the system, will inspire some of you to try to change that system, to make patents work better, to fund actual inventors instead of corporate lawyers, to create a world where the people who imagine the future actually get to benefit from it. The story of who invented radio is really a story about how we decide what's true, who gets remembered, and what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want a world where innovation is rewarded, or where power is rewarded? Do we want a world where truth matters, or where whoever has the best lawyers writes history? Those questions are still relevant today. The battles over radio patents might be over, but the battles over AI, biotechnology, renewable energy, and countless other fields are just beginning. The lessons from a century ago still apply. The final verdict. So who really invented radio? If you want the simple answer, Multiple people invented different aspects of radio technology, but Tesla's work was the most fundamental and came first. The Supreme Court said so. If you want the complicated answer, radio was the product of accumulated scientific knowledge, developed by dozens of researchers over several decades. Hertz proved electromagnetic waves existed. Lodge demonstrated wireless transmission. Bose showed how it could work practically. Popoff built the first working system. Tesla developed the fundamental patents for tuned transmission and reception. Marconi figured out how to commercialize it and make money from it. But if you want the honest answer, we've been asking the wrong question. The question isn't who invented radio. The question is why we need to assign credit to one person at all. Science is collaborative. Technology builds on previous work. Every inventor stands on the shoulders of the people who came before. The obsession with finding the one true inventor serves corporate interests that want to control patents, nationalistic interests that want to claim glory, and the human desire for simple stories with clear heroes. But it doesn't serve the truth. The truth is that radio emerged from the work of many brilliant people, most of whom were screwed by the system in various ways. Some, like Marconi, used business savvy and social connections to get rich. Others, like Tesla, had vision and genius, but terrible business skills. Others, like Popoff and Bose, faced political and racial barriers that prevented them from getting credit. The system didn't reward the best inventors, it rewarded the best connected inventors. And that distinction matters because the system hasn't changed. We're still operating under the same basic patent law framework. We still have government corporate collusion. We still have racial and national bias. We still have situations where the wrong people get rich and the right people struggle. The Supreme Court ruling in 1943 should have been a watershed moment, a recognition that the history we'd been taught was wrong. But it was buried by wartime news, ignored by history textbooks, and forgotten by everyone except patent lawyers and engineering historians. Maybe it's time to dig it back up and actually learn from it. Where we go from here? What do you think? Did you know any of this before today? Did you learn in school that Marconi invented radio? Because I'm betting most of you did. That's what I was taught too. The story of radio's invention is just one example of how history gets written by the winners, how corporate power shapes what we think we know, and how the truth can be buried for decades before finally emerging. But here's the thing, now you know. You know that Tesla was vindicated by the Supreme Court. You know that Popoff demonstrated radio first. You know that Bose's contributions were ignored. You know that the patent system was corrupt then and still is now. You know that $800 million was at stake, and the government manipulated the legal system to avoid paying it. So what do you do with that knowledge? Do you just file it away as an interesting historical footnote and move on? Or do you start questioning other things you've been taught? Do you start looking more critically at how the patent system works today, how corporations operate, how government serves powerful interests? The inventors who created radio were brilliant, flawed, ambitious people who changed the world. Some of them got screwed. Some of them did the screwing. But all of them were operating in a system that valued money and power over innovation and truth. That system is still here. It's still screwing over inventors. It's still making the wrong people rich. It's still burying the truth when it's inconvenient. But unlike a century ago, we have the internet. We have access to Supreme Court decisions and patent records and academic papers. We can learn the truth if we want to. We don't have to accept the simplified story we're fed. So here's my final question. If we know the system is broken, if we know it's been broken for over a century, what are we going to do about it? Let me know in the comments what you think about this story. Did Marconi deserve credit for commercializing radio, even if he didn't invent it? Should Tesla have gotten richer recognition in his lifetime? Is the patent system fundamentally broken, or can it be fixed? And what inventor or technology story do you want me to cover next? Because trust me, there are plenty more stories like this one. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the geniuses and criminals who built our modern world. Share this with someone who still thinks Marconi invented radio. Let's spread the actual history, not the corporate propaganda version, because the truth matters, even if it took 100 years to come out.